Thank you so much to you and Now in a Minute for inviting me. It's such a pleasure and an honor to come and share stories and something, around my experience of storytelling with everyone here. It makes me so excited when people get excited about storytelling and want to hear more. So, alhamdulillah, I'm really grateful and honored to be invited. How is everyone? Yeah, alhamdulillah, good. So, yeah, we've got a couple of, just under 2 hours. So I thought I might introduce some stories, and then maybe we can have a chance to talk and see how you feel. If you want to have a chance, maybe sharing some short stories with each other, we can play with that and see how we go. Yeah, I started telling stories more professionally about 15, 16 years ago. And storytelling in the UK is very healthy. There's been a big revival in traditional storytelling last sort of 30, 40 years. Storytelling in Wales has been in a really good place, though the big festival has just announced that it's actually closing, but I think there'll probably be a replacement. It was called Beyond the Border. Which has flown a flag for storytelling and Welsh stories in particular. There's a Scottish storytelling centre. There's adult storytelling clubs across the country, and schools are inviting storytellers in regularly. So storytelling's in a healthy way across the islands really of Britain and Ireland. And what we can talk about in a little while, and what I hope to kind of give you a sample of, is what happens for a storyteller. And you heard in my introduction, I love stories of all kinds, and I have a special love for stories from Islamic tradition. And storytellers generally find their niche and their repertoire, and that kind of, so I've got friends who specialise in East Anglian stories. Wow, Cornish stories, that's just within the UK, as well as we have Zoroastrian storytellers who specialise in Appalachian stories from the States. It's extraordinary, the range of stories that you get when you go to a storytelling festival. It's like Glastonbury, but with tents for stories from like all around the world, and really specific, Yorkshire, Dartmoor. Amazing. London story, So I guess since I first started telling stories, I've been researching the Islamic canon, if you like. So that's something I wanted to give you a little flavour of today, the kinds of stories. Our canon is very, very broad, is what I've found. Stories from sacred text, Quran and Hadith, and we mentioned a little bit of that. And those, we can talk about that. Those kind of need a particular kind of telling. So if I want to tell us a version of Cinderella, I'm free to make things up. I can set it in East London, I can do what I want with it, really. You have to still respect the story, but I can, you can't do that with a sacred story. So I've worked with a lot of storytellers from different faiths, and we've had lots of really interesting conversations about research, about how you tell with integrity, how you get things checked. I make sure I check all my stories, but still, telling sacred stories to a Muslim audience is the hardest thing, because someone always comes afterwards and says, that wasn't quite, or where did you get that? And that isn't, so you really feel the gravitas of that. It can be quite a responsibility, but a beautiful one, and you feel you're learning as you tell them. And then we also have, so I've tried to bring you a little bit of everything today. We also have our folk tales, of which there are just so many. Our stories from devotional poetry, from Rumi, Nizami, Jami, the Persian, epics, as well as our tradition of satire and comedy. And often when I tell those stories, people get really surprised. I told them at a storytelling festival a few years ago, didn't know Muslims were funny? And people said to me afterwards, it was much funnier than I thought. We have this amazing tradition of comedic stories. So I'm really excited about our repertoire, and like I said, I love all kinds of stories. I love particularly stories from the English countryside, from nature, stories about the trees, the flowers, the places that I grew up with in the south of England. So stories, tell us so much about ourselves and about the world that we're in. So I might start with a story and then we'll have a pause, and then maybe I'd love to hear your interest in storytelling as well. Would be really nice. So yes, this is a story that I heard from. It's one of the nicest ways to learn a story is from another storyteller. A lot of the time we're kind of revivalists. We're learning stories from books or collections of books, which is a big issue in translation for us, actually, as Muslims. When you hear a story that you love from another storyteller, you get a real buzz from that. It's really exciting. And I heard this story from a brilliant Midland storyteller. He's from the Black Country. He's called Graham Langley, and he's been at the real forefront of the revival of storytelling. And I really like it. I mean, storytellers like to say that storytelling is the oldest art form in the world. I don't know if it's true, but it spins a good yarn, and that's what storytellers like doing. Sometimes I imagine it. Before there were any pictures, even the simplest of drums, any music, any screens that pull us away from ourselves and away from each other, there was the word. And I imagine them, those who came before us, sitting around a fire, the dark night behind them, the unknown, the uncertain, and the crackle and hiss of the wood and the embers, and hanging above it all, a word. And with one word came another word, and then came the sentences, and then came the stories, passed down, one generation to the next, the elders to the young, grandparents to grandchildren. And they have lives of their own, these words, these stories. They thrum with all that lineage that they've been through. And if we really listen, we can hear them whispering in our blood and our bones. They say that long, long, long ago there was once an old woman who walked. She walked day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. No one knew how long she'd been walking for. I mean, maybe she'd been walking her whole life. Maybe she'd been walking forever. Everywhere she went, from the tiniest village to the grandest of cities, she would go to a door of a house and she would knock. And they would open the door, and they would see her, and they would look her up and down, and they would slam the door in her face. But she'd keep trying. They'd open. A visitor, a guest. Oh, it's you. Oh, go away. Oh, we don't want you. And they'd slam the door every single time. No one would let her in. One day, our old woman, walking all day as she's always done, arrives in a town. And as always happens, she knocks at the door, they send her away, and now she takes a rest at a bench under a tree. And she watches. And into the town walks a young man. He seems to have a bounce when he walks, almost like a dance. His hair is curly and wild. There's a sparkle in his eye, and he's wearing the most extraordinary cloak of different colours. It's shot through with golds and silvers, and it swirls around his ankles like a summer mist. And he goes up to the same door that she went to and he knocks. And they open the door. Oh, they say, you're here, come in. Oh, he's here. And he goes into the house and the old woman sits watching, and she can hear, she's close enough to hear the sound of laughter and the sound of glasses and the sound of crockery. He stays in there for ages, laughing, talking, eating, drinking. And then he comes out and they wave him off. See you again, they say, see you again. And he goes to the next house. And the same thing happens. Oh, they say, come in, you're here, we're so glad to see you. Well, she watches him do this all afternoon. Until he comes out of the house and she can't help herself. She gets up and she goes to him. And she says, I've been watching you. Everywhere they go, you go, they let you in. Everywhere I go, they shut me out. And he says, Grandmother, who are you? And she says, I am truth. Why, who are you? And he says, I am story. Come into the folds of my cloak, and together they'll let us both in. These next stories are about the great trickster of the Islamic tradition. You might know his name. Sometimes he's called Mullah Nasr ad-Din. Sometimes he's called Joha, or in Egypt or the Arabic countries where they say a girl, he's called Goha. In Turkey, they call him Nasr ad-Din Hoja. I think they even have a name for him in China. Effendi, I think they call him amongst the Chinese Muslims. But the stories are the same. Slightly different outer forms, but essentially the bones of the story are the same. And what is also the same is whenever you mention his name to people, from Morocco to Pakistan or Iran, whatever name he's got, whether he's Mullah Nasr ad-Din, Joha, people burst out laughing. They say, that Joha, that Nasr ad-Din. Now, Nasr ad-Din, sometimes he's a judge, sometimes he's an imam, sometimes he's an ordinary man, sometimes he's a wise fool, sometimes a foolish wise man. You have to listen to the story and decide for yourself. So, when we have a folk tale, I say, a story, and you say, let it come, let it go. Should we try it? A story. Let it come, let it go. That's very good. But we like it another time. Storytellers can't help that. A story. Let it come, let it go. Once upon a time, long ago, Mullah Nasr ad-Din lived in a landlocked kingdom. Now, the old king died, and his son came to power as the new king. And this kingdom was surrounded by tall mountain ranges, and many people went over the mountain range through those high passes to trade, to visit, to do their business, to work. And Mullah Nasr ad-Din was exactly the same. Off he would ride on his donkey over that pass, and he would see students. He said he had an aunt the other side of the pass, and he would go maybe 2-3 times a week. Now, when the new king came to power, he saw a lot of moving around across the borders, and he said, I think I'm losing a lot of revenue. I think I need a new tax law about people coming and going across the borders of my kingdom, because if they're not paying tax on their goods, the treasury is losing out. And so he installed at each of those paths up to the high passes across the mountains, like, what's it called? Not called exile, is it? Right, something like that. There was a taxman there. And the first time Mullah Nasruddin passed through, they nodded to him and off he went. What was this? A few days later, he was making the same journey. And a few days after that, the same journey. And the taxman grew rather suspicious. He said, I'm sure that mullah is trading something. And I'm sure that the treasury is losing out on what he owes. So they began to ask him, Assalamu alaikum mullah. Alaikum salam, he would say. Mullah, do you have anything to declare? Well, what's the nature of your business today? And he said, I'm going to visit my aunt. See? A few days later, he's going to see some of his students. A few days later, he has see someone about his gout. You know, there's always an excuse as to why he's making this journey 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week. The taxman starts to wait for him. Oh, there's that mullah again. He thinks he can get the better of me, but I'm going to find out what he's up to. So they began to stop him, and they began to search him. And this is a story from long, long ago, but it has it is a bit, it has an echo of travelling whilst Muslim, does it not? So they would stop him and say, right, empty out your pockets, please. Empty out his pockets, his purse, his pouch, nothing. They began to grow frustrated. Mullah, take off your shoes. Check his shoes, check his turban. Also rather redolent of travelling whilst Muslim. Can't find anything. The taxman is convinced. Tiny diamonds, maybe a powder of some kind. Something he's hiding. I'm sure of it. And they never find it. And this goes on, not just for a few months, but it starts to go on for years. That taxman becomes obsessed. I mean, really obsessed. He stops the mullah, he keeps him there an hour, 2, asking him, checking him. He checks the donkey, checks the teeth of the donkey, checks the hooves of the donkey, the tail. Never finds a single thing. But now the taxman, he starts dreaming about it. I know that mullah's up to something. And he can't stop talking about it. His wife said, stop talking about Mullah Nasruddin. And it starts to take over this whole life of this man. And the years pass, and they never find anything, contraband, anything suspicious, nothing. And eventually, time passes as it does, and our taxman, it's time for him to retire. He's satisfied in general with his work, except he never got to the bottom of what was going on. So now he's retired, he no longer works for the crown. He goes into a tea house. He sees the mullah sitting, drinking a little glass of cardamom tea. And he sits down, he says, Mullah, I don't work for the crown anymore. I don't work for the king. You have to tell me, all these years, come on, were you smuggling? Just tell me it will go no further. I swear, on the Quran, it will go no further. Just tell me the truth. And the mullah says to him, okay. I admit it, all these years I was smuggling. I knew it, he says, I knew it. Oh, you were so good, I could never find it. What was it? Rubies, diamonds, some rare powder of that rare plant. What was it? Oh, said the mullah, it was donkeys. Oh, yeah. You know what I love about these stories, and I love the name Nasruddin, like the help of the support of the deen, the victory of the deen. There's something about if we can just laugh a little bit at ourselves, if we can just have a little bit of satire, a little bit of comedy. You know, what's the shifa, what's the healing property, the kind of calibrating property of just a little bit of humor. So I like this one for, once you start with Nasruddin stories, the problem is they go on forever. I think they even have a festival in Turkey. It's days often. There's hundreds of these stories. But one that I really like for Ramadan, and that also coincides with a lot of English folklore as well, has Mullah Nasruddin walking home from iftar during the month of Ramadan. And you know the one, isn't it, where you've just had a little bit too much and you're kind of, you're walking out. But, you know, we're halfway through the month, so of course the moon is full, right? Full moon. Bright, it's the only light in the village, shining across the land. And Mullah Nasruddin is walking home, rolling home a little bit, and he gets to the village well. And he passes by and he looks into the well. What does he see? The moon has fallen from the sky and is trapped in the water. He says, Ya Allah, the moon is trapped in the well. He says, Ya Allah, if the moon is trapped in the well, it will never wane and Ramadan will never end. He says, hang on, hold tight, shine bright, help is at hand, I'm here. And he looks around, he can't find a bucket, a rope, anything. He thinks, I've got my imamah. He takes his imamah off and he ties a knot at the end. And then he ties a stone into the cloth to weight it down. But he says, I'm going to pull you out right now. And he throws the imamah with the stone tied in it to weight it down into the well. It goes, ooh, bloop, falls into the water. Assalamu alaikum, welcome, please. It falls down into the well and it falls right to the bottom, where it catches on a stone that's jutting out of the bottom of the well. But it looks to him as if he's caught the moon in his knot that he's tied. He says, don't worry, I'm gonna save you right now. And he starts to pull and pull and pull. And if you still tell this story with children, you can get them pulling and pulling. And he pulls and he pulls and he pulls until that stone at the bottom of the well comes loose with all his pulling. And Mullah Nasruddin goes flying through the air and lands splat on his back. And as he's lying there on his back, staring up into the sky, what does he see? The full moon sailing across the sky. He says, fly free, shine bright. Good job I was passing. Yeah, Mullah Nasruddin, wise fool, foolish wise man, who knows? I'll tell one more of those and then we'll leave the mullah for a little while. I really like this one. Mullah Nasruddin was a great teacher, and people came from all over the province to sit and learn with him. He was a very respected sheikh. And one day, one of his students is walking past him, and after their lesson, and he's seeing the mullah throwing crumbs, distributing crumbs across his courtyard. It's like this, like seeds. He's throwing them around, breadcrumbs. He says, Mullah, what are you doing? And he says, I'm throwing crumbs around my courtyard. He says, but Mullah, why? He says, deterring tigers. Mullah, there are no tigers in this area. You see, he said it's effective, isn't it? Yeah, Mullah Nasruddin. I mean, sometimes we see so much, sometimes of someone else, sometimes of ourselves, isn't it? But I think they're such a brilliant device, because that little bit of satire, self-deprecating humor, and, all the kind of learning that sometimes it delivers a message that can't quite, we might not be able to hear another way. Story, I tell this story a lot in school, actually. It's a story it's in the Masnavi of Rumi, but I think Rumi kind of gathered a lot of folk tales that were told at the time and then put his kind of spin on them, kind of pulled extra, there's already lessons in there, but kind of brought them into his kind of commentary. So we can only guess really how old this story is. If it's in the Masnavi, it's already a good 800 years old. I think so. It's probably a lot older than that as a story. So it survived all this time. There's lots of different versions of this story, with some of the key things being different. But this is the one that I like. So, a story. Oh, you forgot it. Let it come. Let it go. Once upon a time, long, long, long ago, there once was and once was not a king. Powerful king, large kingdom, wealthy man. And to help him run his kingdom, he had a whole host of advisors and ministers. And every morning he would put on his kingly clothes and he would go and sit on his throne and he would hear the business of the day, and his ministers and his advisors would help him, give him the news. And the king would always ask the same questions. Are the people fed? Do the sick have medicine? And are the children learning? And every day his ministers, yes, Your Majesty. Of course, Your Majesty. Oh, yes, of course, Your Majesty. And the king would be pleased and satisfied. The thing is that those answers were the same every single day. There was never anything different. There was never, oh, well, in this area we have this problem, Your Majesty, or, well, actually, something has come to our notice, Your Majesty. No. Every day, exactly the same answers. And the king, of course, grew rather suspicious. He began to think to himself, I don't think my ministers are telling me the truth. I don't think my advisors are telling me the reality of what is really happening in my kingdom. And so he decided, because he was a king who was committed to his people, and he decided that he would find out for himself. And so that night he excused himself from the court. He said, I have a headache. And he went up to his chamber and he locked the door and he took off his kingly clothes, and instead he put on a rough woolen cloak with a hood. The shadows hid the features of his face. And he went out the secret door in his room, because every chamber in a story has to have a secret door. And he went out and he went down the corridor and out into the city from the back of the palace, not the grand entrance, the beautiful front door. But there he was in the back streets of the city. And covered in his cloak, he began to walk around the city and see what was going on for himself. And that first night that he did it, he discovered that it was true. His ministers had been hiding a lot from him. He saw people begging for food. The people were not fed. He saw sick people in the streets who were not having medicine. He saw children working late in the night markets who were not in school. And when he sat at the different inns and restaurants and spoke with people who'd come from all over the kingdom, they told him the same thing across the land. Well, night after night now, the king did the same thing. Covered in his rough cloak, off he would go, out into the streets of his city, where he learned more and more and more about the truth of what was really going on. And one night, he went further and deeper into the city than he'd ever been before, and he found himself lost in a rather shabby-looking neighborhood. It was looking quite dodgy. There were no bright lights in the windows. The shadows were long. He could hear the scuttling of cats, rats around him. There were puddles and potholes. And when he turned one way and he turned the other, and he thought, I'm completely lost in this maze of alleyways. And as he walked faster and faster, trying to find the way out of the neighborhood, he turned a really sharp corner, and suddenly there in front of him, a group of men sitting around a brazier holding their hands up to the flames. And the corner was so sharp, and he was right in front of them, and there was nowhere for him to hide. And they looked at him, and they said, "Who are you?" And he, thinking on his feet, said, "I am as you are." And they said, "Oh, really? Because if you are as we are, We are master thieves. Each of us with a unique talent. And the king, seeing that he could buy himself some time with people talking about their unique talents, said, really? Tell me more. And that was what they were waiting for. And these men said, well, let us tell you all about us. And the firelight danced on their faces. And they invited him to sit, not too close, but motioned for him to sit. And the first man said, I have such ears that I can understand the language of the dogs when they bark. And the king said, that must be very informative. And the man nodded. And the second man said, I have such a nose that I can smell out treasure of any kind. Gold, jewels, silver, whether it's locked in a safe of metal and wood, I can sniff it out. None of it gets away from me. Very useful. And the third man said, I have such a throw that I can throw a rope ladder over any wall. There's nowhere I can't get into. If the wall is covered in glass, blades, if it's as smooth as glass, doesn't matter. I can get my rope ladder over it, and I can get in anywhere. And the next man said, well, let me tell you about me. He said, let you tell me about me. I have such hands, such strength, that I can rip open any door made of any substance. Very handy, said the king. And the last one said, I have such eyes that I can recognize anyone, whatever disguise they've got, however they look, man, woman, or child. If I even catch a glimpse of them from a distance, I can recognize them again. No one gets away from me. And together, we're the most formidable band of thieves that's ever been seen. That's extraordinary, says the king. And they said, but you've heard about us. What about you? You said that you are as we are. What's your special skill? And the king, thinking, quickly says, well, I have such a beard that with one pull on my beard and one nod of my head, I can have any condemned man freed. And they said, well, we've never been caught and we're unlikely to be caught because that's how good we are, but you could be a good investment for us. You're welcome to join our band. And they moved him closer to the fire, invited him to warm his hands at the brazier and enjoy the firelight. And they said, hey, you've joined on just the right night, because tonight we've got the most audacious, bodacious, outrageous robbering trip of our lives, of our whole careers planned. He said, really? He said, yes, tonight we're going to rob the treasury of the king himself. Wow, says the king, how extraordinary. They said, come on. The king's guard will be changing soon. Now's the right time. Come with us. And they put out the fire. And they began to lead the king through the shadows of that labyrinthine neighborhood and back towards the city center where the palace was. And they moved quietly through the shadows, through those alleyways. And as they came out onto the wider streets, the dogs of the city began to bark. And the man with the ears said, wait. Oh, what do your dogs tell you tonight? Come on, said the others. He said, no, wait. The dogs are telling me the king is with you. That's ridiculous, they said. We've listened to your dogs before, but that's clearly nonsense. You're wasting time. The change of the guard is soon. Let's go. Okay, so they press on through the shadows like cats, moving quietly. They come to the city walls, they come to the palace walls, and the man with the nose says, oh, he says, we're close. Yes, it's over this 20-foot wall. Yes, it's under 7 doors of iron and another whole wall of brick, but I can smell it, the treasury of the king. Here strongest here it is. And the man with the throw gets his rope ladder The wall is, 20 feet, 30 feet. It's the biggest wall that's ever been built. And he throws the rope ladder over the wall, and one by one they climb up and over. And they're in the palace grounds of the king. The man with the nose leads them to the great door of the treasury. How hard can it be for our friend with the... rips it like paper. Like that, iron doors, just through them all. The brick wall, it's that thick, flicks it, through they go, and they're into the treasury of the king. And those robbers, they've never seen anything like it. Even for the master robbers, it's extraordinary. Piles of gold, strings of pearls, rubies, rare perfumes, and they've got their sacks and they just fill them up. And they fill their pockets and they fill their shoes and they carry as much treasure as they can. They're quite strong men, actually. And then they go, right, now let's go before the guards come. And in a flash, before the guards who've changed to even know what's happening, they're up over that rope ladder, down and off through the streets of the city. They go out to a small copse of trees, a small wood, where there's a cave. And they say, we're going to hide our stash here until tomorrow. And then we'll all come back at midday, divide up the stash and go on our way when everything's cooled down a bit. Their newest member of the band is missing. And instead, the king's guard is there, waiting to arrest them all. Bound and chained, the master thieves are led back into the city, back to the palace of the king, and into the court, where the Qadi, the judge, is sitting, ready to charge them with high treason, robbing the treasury of the king. One of the robbers says to the others, he says, look, they can't prove it was us. We were just there for a day out in the woods. We didn't know the treasure was there. They've got no witnesses. They can't prove a thing. In that moment, who walks into the court but the king? And he's wearing his kingly robes now. But the man with the eyes recognizes him. Oh no, he says, it was the king. And if the king is a witness against us, there's no hope. And so the Qadi, the judge, hears all of this evidence, and he has no choice, really. He has to sentence the robbers to death. Everyone in the court goes silent. They're struck now by the heaviness of this moment as the condemned men are led off out to the prisons to be executed the next day. And now they turn round and one of them speaks and they say, Your Majesty, last night you told us that you are as we are. And last night you heard all about our extraordinary talents, and you told us that you too have an extraordinary talent. And now is the time for you to show it to us. And the king remembered what he said. And he paused for a moment and he realized that he had been given an opportunity for mercy. And that he had been given an opportunity to be compassionate. And he took it. He tucked on his beard and he nodded his head and he turned to the Qadi and he said, the condemned men are released and free to go. They couldn't believe it. That was it. And there was lots of murmuring and surprise all around the court as the robbers began to make their way out of the door. But now the king called them back and he said, no, you wait. I'm in need of some new ministers. I'm in need of some new advisors. Will you stay and use your extraordinary talents for ruling my kingdom with me? And well, as far as I've heard, as far as the story goes, They did. And well, as far as I know, they're still there now. And that is the story of the king and the thieves. Sometimes there's 5, sometimes there's 3, but there's always a moment of change. And to say something about telling stories from the seerah, because it's been a real journey for me telling stories from the seerah. And when I was first asked to do it, I was a bit nervous. I did my research and I had scholars check it. And I kind of felt like I was fulfilling my duty on a kind of on accuracy level. You know, I'm being accurate. I'm not saying anything that is incorrect. You know, I've kind of felt the gravitas of telling stories about the Prophet ﷺ. But it's been over the years that I've realized, like, it really, really humbled me, actually, when you realize the extent to which having these stories in your life changes the landscape of your heart. And being asked then, will you tell the story about this from the Prophet's life? Will you tell the story about that, alayhi salatu wassalam? And you have to go and do a lot of work, and you have to ask 4 different people to check what you've done and that it's accurate. But that's just the outer husk, really, compared to what absolute benefits for yourself of having these stories in your life. So that's kind of what I've begun to realize the last few years, is the way that the stories about the Prophet impact us, and impact us when we tell them, and impact us when we hear them. But also just to kind of, to sort of really, really honor and celebrate this tradition of stories from the seerah, and how unique they are for our storytelling tradition. They are completely unique to our storytelling tradition. Some stories we share with lots of traditions, but not these ones. These ones are so unique, and they're such an extraordinary canon of stories. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We'll begin. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala Sayyidina Muhammad, with prayers and blessings on the noblest of messengers. The camel that the Prophet rode, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, made her way through the streets of Yathrib. Her fur was cream-coloured. She walked with a lilt. Her name was Qaswa. She had carried the Prophet ﷺ all the way on the hijrah from Mecca. When the people of Yathrib saw the Prophet ﷺ riding Qaswa, they began to call out to him. The people of Bani Najjar, Ya Rasulallah, O Prophet of God, come and live with us here. The Prophet ﷺ, he nodded to them graciously, but then dropped the reins of Qaswa and let her find her own way through the streets of Yathrib. She walked on with that lilting walk of camels, her footprints round on the sandy streets. Yathrib, not like Mecca. Yathrib, oasis city, green, date orchards, walled gardens, and the people peering and looking. The Prophet had arrived, alayhi salatu wassalam. And Qaswa walked through the streets of Yathrib until she arrived at a tumble-down, abandoned plot of land, broken down walls, And she walked in, she turned in, and she walked around. And she began to fold up her legs the way camels do to sit down before standing up again and walking around once more, until she finally settled, as if to say, we have arrived. We are home. Nabi Muhammad, upon him be peace, he asked about who this land belonged to, and two orphans said, Ya Rasulullah, it belongs to us, but we will gift it to you. And the Prophet, upon him be peace, replied, no, I will only pay you for it. And so the land was bought, and work began to build homes for the Prophet and his family, alayhi salatu wassalam, and to build that first masjid in Yathrib. It was a simple building, built from split palm trunks for pillars, and the roof from dried palm branches, and the courtyard open to the bright blue Hijazi sky. That was it, so simple, so simple. Not like now. Well, now it's beautiful. The marble and the dome that opens and the parasol. And we think of all the other incredible masajid around the world, the other incredible mosques, and the mosques of Timbuktu and Jenne and Istanbul, Isfahan. All incredible testimonies of faith, mashallah, but really that masjid, there in Yathrib. Is there anywhere else that we would rather pray than in that place behind that Imam? Sallallahu alayhi wasallam. When the Prophet, upon him be peace, began to live and teach and pray in Yathrib, Yathrib was gone. Yathrib was no longer, and Yathrib became Medinat al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet. Medinat al-Nur, the city lit up and illuminated by his presence, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. The Muslims wanted to give the Prophet a gift, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And when he used to teach and speak, upon him be peace, in that place, he would lean against an old dried up palm trunk. And they said to him, Ya Rasulullah, let us build you a minbar like a pulpit, a lectern to speak from. And the Prophet, upon him be peace, ever gracious, accepted the gift. We don't know how long it took, maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks. But the community built the Prophet, upon him be peace, a minbar of wood to speak from, to lean from, as he gave his khutbah and taught the people. They brought it into that masjid, that simple masjid, split palm trunks, roof of dried palm branches. The rest of it open to the blue Hijazi sky. And on that very first day, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam walked through the way through the mosque to the new minbar to use it, thanking the people for it. He walked past that old palm trunk, and suddenly a cry ripped through the air as if that blue Hijazi sky was torn in two. And the people turned. They thought maybe an animal had been hurt or that someone had been wounded. And the cry rose louder and louder and louder through those dried palm branches, up and echoing around and around. It sounded as if someone was at the very heart of their sorrow, the very depths of their pain. Peace went over to the palm trunk and began to speak to it. And with his words, the crying began to drop. And with his touch, the crying dropped even further. And with his embrace, had not comforted her, she would have wept until Yawm al-Qiyamah. And the companions thought to themselves, if a dried up palm trunk can weep for the yearning for Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, what about us? What about us? Well, news of this miracle spread through the streets of Medina like a fine and fragrant perfume. And the fragrance of it has spread throughout the years and through the time and across the lands and across the seas until it's reached us here. the time when the palm tree wept for the yearning for Rasulullah. What I'm going to suggest is that you get into pairs, and I'll keep the time. I've got a clock bottle somewhere. And just have 5 minutes each. Some of you might be in a 3. Just have 5 minutes each. And it doesn't matter if you don't finish the story. Just tell a part of a story is fine. And just have a go at telling your story to someone. And the other partner, just have a go at listening, because storytelling is also about listening. And see what happens. And if we have time, we'll have stage 2 of that exercise. So I'm going to keep time for you. So you can choose a story. It could be from your life. It could be of how you arrived here today. It could be a short story or part of a story from the seerah. It could be something that you've heard today or part of what you've heard today. It could be a story that you remember from your childhood or another time or anything, really.
How did you get into storytelling? Some people already asked me this, but I guess I'll ask you for more to hear who are in the room. How did you get into storytelling, and what compelled you to continue to pursue it as an art form? Because it's not like I would say it's like a popular or like one that you can go in and like study at university and be like, I'm a storyteller. So how is it something that you like? Why is it something you continued to pursue?
I mean, I've always been passionate about stories. Folk tales, fairy tales, mythology, always. They were always my most favourite. I've still got stacks of folk tales, and you know, so they were always like what I was excited about when I was a child. And then years ago, a good sort of 15 odd years ago, a friend of mine took me one night. She said, "Oh, I know this storytelling place," and she took me to a storytelling club called the Crick Crack Club that used to be at the Barbican Theatre. In their small theatre, not the posh, not the big theatre. Yeah. And I loved it. There's different storytellers, different traditions. And then I went to, there's a society for storytelling, and I went to their AGM. They had a big AGM. And I met someone there who invited me to an interfaith storytelling group based in London at a peace centre. And they said, "Oh, we don't have any Islamic stories." And I was a bit like, "Well, neither have I don't know." You know. But I went along and slowly started to learn, and with the help of some of the storytellers there around working with text, around how we do that. And then they had a conference called Narratives of Hope, and they were the first. That was the first time I was asked to tell stories in public, professionally. Yeah. And that was it, really. I was just like, right.
Well, it's a lot to memorize as well. Like, you don't have any notes around you.
Yes.
How is that? It's like
well, I think when I first started storytelling, I did learn things, not quite word for word, but almost. And I've had a few choking moments, right? I've had a few where I've just forgotten the next thing. Now, partly as I've got older, busier, children, and I worry less about forgetting, unless it's a very serious telling. You try and remember the images more than the words. So actors will memorise a script, but storytellers don't really. So I have notes, I draw pictures, I have a way of learning a story. So I kind of see it in my mind's eye, and I'm telling what's in my mind's eye. So if I have a new story, I have to rehearse it.
Yeah.
But
do you know how many stories you know?
I probably know. I'd have in my Islamic folktales folder, I have about 70 or 80. In my non-Islamic folktale folder, I have about 60 or 70. I have seerah stories from the Quran, Qasas al-Anbiya, and then all the seerah stories.
You know all of them?
Yeah.
So it's like over 140.
Yeah. I mean, if someone says, right, we need you to tell Yusuf and Zulaikha tomorrow, right, I'd have to go and polish it up. Yeah. So I get the notes out, I go over it, I rehearse it, I go to my allotment, I go for a walk. I think, oh, what do I think about that today? You know, well, I used to rehearse it like word for word. Now my process is a bit different. Now I'm like, but what's it saying to me today? What do I think about that today? What do I feel about that today? It's a bit more loose.
Yeah. I suppose it's not like somebody's going to be like, oh, well, you missed out a word there.
With the folk tales, no. With stories from the Quran, or stories from the Seerah, yeah, then I have to get it. And some of the stories have a lot of detail in. The name of this person, the name where they went, how many dirhams it cost to buy that, you know. So that stuff I have to get. I go over it so that it's fresh. That yeah.
And how do you define storytelling as an art form? I asked this from somebody that works in social media. Like, my understanding of storytelling is like so different to, well, actually, I don't know if it'll be different to your understanding of storytelling, but like, communication is like my job, my field, but that's in a digital form. So we can talk about more how the digital side has had an impact on the traditional side as well. But let's first define what you think it is.
Well, I think you're right. I think storytelling is any kind of narrative. Traditional storytelling in the oral tradition is about telling a particular canon or heritage or traditional set of stories that you're immersed in. And most people I know are immersed in one tradition or repertoire or another. So building your repertoire as a storyteller is a really, really big deal. And most people are immersed in one kind of, whether it's Celtic stories. I know some Welsh storytellers, they tell the Mabinogion, and it's amazing. Irish storytellers. So a lot of people are immersed in one tradition. So I'd say traditional oral storytelling is different from how a lot of people use storytelling.
So would you say you get better access to the culture through their stories?
Sorry?
Would you get better access to the culture through the stories?
Well, I don't know if you... Yeah, I suppose the stories are carriers of the culture. And I think we really see that in our folk tales, but also in our Seerah stories. I feel that really strongly for Muslims, and a lot of people who are not Muslim also really enjoy the Seerah stories as well. So I think they're carriers of culture.
Can I say, actually, you can see the similarities as well in the culture, because I think everything that
100%.
from the past,
And that's very beautiful.
we still have the same needs and wants and whatever. So each tradition,
You see the echoes. They do, and you can see how a story is moved. There's a story. Yeah. There's a story that I didn't get a chance to tell you, but it's another story that I tell from Rumi. There's a lot of stories in Rumi. And the same story is a very popular English folk tale. So it travelled. They're not very interested in passports or where they're supposed to go or not go stories. They're not concerned about that, yeah.
I was going to say, the medium as well, because do you only read in English, the stories, or do you have other languages?
I read in Arabic as well. So if I'm looking at the Seerah or the Quran, then I look at the Arabic for that, yeah.
That's the understanding, because obviously English is the medium.
Yeah.
You know,
So it changes it, and I think that's really important, because there's something about preserving folk stories, and a lot of folk story collections that you can find that are from around the Muslim world have been really, really badly translated, criminally translated, often to kind of sometimes wash the Islam out of them a bit, or to change words into something you think, and you kind of get what you kind of, it's a bit archaeological. You sort of think, I don't think that means that. Well, why have you chosen that word? You know, so there's something really important about how they're preserved, the medium, the translation, all of that is really crucial stuff. So a lot of research, a lot of thinking.
Do you tell them yourself in Arabic? Or just that you refer to the Arabic too?
It's a bit of a struggle. I'd struggle to tell a long story in Arabic, but if it's a story from the Quran or a story from the Seerah or an Arab folk tale, then I would check the original if I can get hold of it. Yeah. Well, the Quran and Seerah I can get hold of it, but so even sometimes with folk tales where I'll check, I'll call someone. What does this word mean? Or what's this? Or
Okay, so it's actually referring back to the Arabic.
yeah.
Not really actually giving the story out in Arabic.
No.
Oh.
Probably one or two short stories I could tell in Arabic, but not. Even if it has a truth in it, like kids, whenever I tell that story about the king and the thieves, the kids go, Miss, is that actually true? And I said, well, what do you think? And we talk about it, and it's like, well, there might be something, there might be a truth. There's truths in that story. Did it actually go down like that? We don't know. So I think a folk tale or a wonder tale has elements that are quite fantastical, whereas history, well, there's always a perspective on history, but history essentially is what happened. So when we do historical storytelling, then that is a different, which, like the seerah, that is a different thing from a folk tale or a wonder tale. So we have to handle them slightly differently. Yeah.
And as we find out, that history is written by who?
100%.
Yeah.
These are the perspectives on the history.
His story. Yeah.
Whose story?
The word itself.
Whose story is it?
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. It belongs to somebody. He's not.
Yeah.
It doesn't particularly mean that it's a story for everybody. It actually belongs
Yeah.
to a particular person.
Yeah.
Whose
Whose perspective? So there's always, you have to take responsibility for the story that you tell, really, whatever it is. You have to take responsibility for it. It's quite halfway. Yeah.
I did notice in your instructions and throughout you were very careful with your references or your points of like the things that you wanted people to pay attention to, because often, going back to the point about digital storytelling, nobody is clarifying or kind of checking the truth or the legitimacy of that, what is being shared. Like when we're scrolling through social media, it's like, oh, okay, another thing, and then it's like, but it's so different the way that you commanded the room and you shared. I have to check and I have to make sure and I have to, study it, and it's such a different style. And it's really, really interesting, like just as a young person to see that, because it's like that's not how I see stories being shared. Even like when we talk about the language of like social media, it's like, let's upload our story. That's like it's like the new concept now. But I think I did want to ask a question around, do you think we particularly as a Muslim community, are good at storytelling?
Oh gosh, yes.
Or do you yes?
Yeah.
Or do you think it's something that we need to be better at doing?
I think there's so many rich traditions of storytelling amongst Muslim communities, exceptional storytelling. I think part of the problem is that storytelling in now as an art form, you get told you've got 7 minutes, and we're going to cut, and you need to be done at 7 minutes because the next person's on, or you've got, whereas you think about storytelling in a lot of Muslim traditions. I know an Algerian storyteller, his preamble, his let it come, let it go, takes 7 minutes. He'll be like, and it all rhymes and it's got this rhythm. I'm Mahi Siddiq, I'm from the east of Algeria, these are the stories from my grandfather and his name was Dakar, and all that. His opening patter takes 7 minutes. And then we're going to have a story, and then we're going to stop for tea, and then So the concept of time is very. Sorry.
Historical, right?
Yeah, I feel like it can be forced into a shape that doesn't suit it here. That's one of my reflections on it.
Yeah, do you have tips for people who want to become a storyteller or be better at communicating the ideas?
Yeah, just, and I say this to myself: just chuck your phone out the window, switch the TV off, have a power cut, and just sit down and I think people, because of the written word and screens, people don't trust their memories. Kids say to me, Miss, how do you remember all that? I said, you can remember it better than me. I'm old, man. But you've got such good memories. And when you trust that you can do it, people commit astounding, especially in our tradition, astounding amounts of things to me. The whole of the Quran, every hadith collection. But people don't trust that their own memories or their capacity to just sit and tell. There must be something else to it. It can't just be, because you can't monetize that. So we're told you can't just sit and talk to each other and tell stories about your family or from your tradition, because who's going to make money out of that?
business now. The web, you know, you do a visual presentation to sell your service, especially when you need to sell a service
Yeah.
or a product. You tell a story.
Yes.
And it has to be a personal story to some extent.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's like the most modern parts of marketing now.
They definitely
If
are.
you don't tell a story, you're not going to
They're
sell
definitely
anything
embedding
now.
some of
So
those
that's
skills.
full circle.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to ask,
Yeah.
what is your views on traditional storytelling becoming modern day cinema?
Becoming modern day cinema, like
They are storytelling.
being turned into films.
Yeah, they are stories in a sense.
I mean, I think it has to evolve.
But do you feel like it's taking some kind of magic, or is it probably adult taking away from
I mean, I think, you know, if you look at something like Disney, who took a lot of top-notch stories and did terrible things to them, but I think it's actually testament to how strong those stories are that something emerges from them that we still... I mean, I don't like what they did, but if you think of something like Sleeping Beauty, it's actually one of my favourite stories ever. It's a very, very powerful story, especially not only for women, but it has a very strong feminine kind of energy to it. So, I mean, if I was going to put money on it, I put money on the traditional stories surviving whatever we do to them.
Yeah, but what makes traditional a bit more special from like a cinema, like if you want to sell it to something?
For me, traditional story is not authored by one person, so they belong to the collective, and so they're very solid. And as narratives, they're completely watertight. And I think that's what makes people drawn to them, because they've got so many voices in them that you can people relate, people hear things about their own lives or their own experience in a traditional story in a way that something authored by one person can't quite reproduce, I think, is the main thing.
My last question to you, and then people can ask me questions, was what are the ingredients for a good story?
Well, we kind of talked about that with action, emotion, description. I mean, you know, we kind of have Jung and his archetypes around a protagonist, a hero, a journey, a quest, someone who helps, a transformation. I mean, we have those kinds of things. You have patterns in stories. I think my favourite stories are stories that I like stories that have some wonder in them, that make me go, wow. I'm a sucker for the wow. You know, I've got other friends who they're not, but I'm like, oh. I love like wonder tales, and I'm like, oh. You know, and I think a moment of change. A moment of change and a moment of hope. Thank you, guys. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.